Hi, I want to introduce you to two terms that you ought to be familiar with and tell you a little bit about what those are about. This has to do with risk factors, and it has a lot to do with the diet and nutrition part of what we eat. The two terms are the Western disease cluster and the metabolic syndrome. You should know those two terms. The metabolic syndrome is actually these cluster of syndromes that seem to come together. And just very quickly, this is abdominal obesity, like fat around the middle, which is different from fat in other parts in the body, elevated blood pressure, elevated fasting plasma glucose, that's the amount of blood sugar in your blood, I mean the sugar in your blood, triglycerides, you know, when you go to the doctor and they're taking your blood, they give you a triglyceride level. Elevated triglycerides is not good. And the high density cholesterol, you have good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. If your good cholesterol is low, that's part of metabolic syndrome. So very quickly, you don't have to know the details, but just that there's these clusters of diseases that are called metabolic syndrome, and they are very much correlated with the type of diet that we have, how much we eat, and the type of things that we eat. The Western disease cluster is this interesting concept, and it's very similar to the metabolic syndrome. There are types of diseases that people in Western developed countries have that people in basically non-Western, but mostly undeveloped countries just don't get. And it has to do really with our level of affluence and our accessibility to processed foods, too many foods. And it's this whole sort of, we've talked about a cascade of risk factors. What's included in the Western disease cluster is inflammation, chronic inflammation, oxidative stress. You've heard about free radicals that are floating around. That's why you take antioxidants, is to try to soak those up. When you have too much of this oxidative stress going on, it starts injuring the body. Insulin pathways. This is the beginning of diabetes. If your insulin is dysregulated, that starts creating all kinds of problems. So elevated glucose, vascular disease, and elevated blood lipids. Again, you don't necessarily have to know these terms. Just be familiar with this idea that there is a Western disease cluster that's very much associated with how we eat and what that does to our system. So two terms, the Western disease cluster, metabolic syndrome.